Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for our first Public Funds, Public Schools webinar of 2022. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm the director of PFPS, which is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund. PFPS works to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen our public schools and are not diverted to private school voucher programs. You can visit our website, pfps.org, for more information and sign up on the contacts page for updates. This webinar is Public Education in Chains, the Road to Privatization of Our Nation's Schools. And today's event features Dr. Nancy MacLean in conversation with Dr. Diane Ravitch, and we are so honored to have them both with us. We're also very grateful that this event is co-sponsored by the Network for Public Education. If you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Don't use the chat. And we'll also record the webinar and post it on our website. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who hardly needs introduction, Dr. Diane Ravitch. Dr. Ravitch is recently retired from NYU. She is an award-winning historian and a best-selling author. Her most recent book, Slaying Goliath, The Passionate Resistance to Privatization and the Fight to Save America's Public Schools. She also writes a blog that I know many of you follow, and we are great admirers of hers. So excited to have her here, and I invite her to take it away.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Public Funds, Public Schools for hosting this meeting. I'm very excited because it's the first time I've met Nancy MacLean, whom I admire so much. Dr. MacLean, and I'm not going to call her Nancy from now on, is the William Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, and she is the author of a book that I urge you all to read. I reviewed it for the New York Review of Books. It's called Democracy in Chains, and it reads like a thriller. It is the story of privatization writ large. So I'm very excited that she has taken an interest in privatization of the public schools because it's something that I've been pounding on for years and not getting much momentum, I think, because the Washington Post and the New York Times are very pro-charter, so they don't get very excited about school choice. And I think that I guess we have to thank Betsy DeVos for alerting all of us to the dangers of privatization, but nonetheless, it's speeding ahead. So I want to open our discussion by inviting Nancy to talk about the history of privatization of public schools.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Diane. And it is just such an honor and pleasure to be here with you and also to be in conversation with folks in the orbit of public funds, public schools. I was thrilled when I looked over the participants list, the folks who had registered for today's webinar, and saw how many different organizations you represent from so many different parts of the country. So we are just thrilled to be with you. And I will start by saying that the book that became Democracy in Chains actually started to be a quite different story. And that's how I learned about the origins of privatization. I had started researching the school closures in Prince Edward County, Virginia from 1959 to 1964, where white county leaders completely shut down the public school system and sent white children off to a private segregation academy while leaving Black children with no schooling whatsoever for 5 years. And I was so moved by that story, I started digging in, and that was when I learned that Milton Friedman, the famed free market economist, had written his first manifesto for school vouchers in 1955 in the full knowledge of how it could be used in the South. And he continued to collaborate with segregationists, I found. But as I started to pull on the Friedman thread, it took me in directions I never anticipated. So it took me to a man named James McGill Buchanan, who was the first US Southerner to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, sadly, for the work that he did during the school crisis in the South on the side of the white state governments that were fighting the Supreme Court. And he actually came up with with a colleague, he came up with a paper that advocated privatization in the language of economics rather than race. And so that got my interest. I started to follow him, and to make a long story short, I learned that it was his ideas that were informing the strategy being put in place by Charles Koch and the network of donors he has convened, and the hundreds of organizations that they fund, including many of those who are in the forefront of the attacks on public education. And I guess the last thing I'd say, just for this opening comment, is that I learned two things that I think are really, really important to keep in mind. One, for the billionaire donors driving the push for privatization and school vouchers, educational improvement is not the key thing they're seeking. They're seeking a fundamental realignment of power in America from libertarian dogma that says government can't do anything well and must be driven out of the business of providing for the public. And just to give you a sense of how stark that vision is for public education, let me quote from Milton Friedman. And he was a man who was consistent throughout his life, from the publication of Capitalism and Freedom in 1962 to the end of his life almost 50 years later. And here's what he said in 2004. He said, "In my ideal world, government would not be responsible for providing education any more than it is for providing food and clothing. Private charity would be more than ample to ensure that there were schools available for every child." In case you didn't get the full meaning of where he was going with that, 2 years later, just before his death, he spoke for the American Legislative Exchange Council, which I know many of you are familiar with. And there, in response to a question, he said, "The ideal way to give parents control of their children's education would be to abolish the public school system and eliminate all the taxes that pay for it." So that is how radical this vision is that is being organized around by this billionaire funded radical right. They're smart enough not to tell us that up front in most cases, but that's really what they're aiming at. So that is why it is crucial that we understand the nature of their end game and the strategies and tactics they use to pursue it.
Thank you, Nancy. You remind me that there are two other books. One is by a lawyer at the University of South Carolina named Derek Black, called Schoolhouse Burning, in which he does a history of education and shows very clearly that education was going to be integrated after the Civil War. The Reconstruction legislatures were black and white, and they passed education they rewrote the state constitution, and the state constitution in every state abolished segregation. And it was after the end of Reconstruction that the state constitutions changed, and that Jim Crow took over, and that the suppression of Black rights was made into law, and everything changed. But there was, at that brief moment during Reconstruction, which I know you know very well, when there was real hope that there could be a racial reconciliation and activity that led to racial equality, although it was a long way to go, but we stopped making any efforts at all after Reconstruction. The other book is by Steve Suitts, S-U-I-T-T-S, of the Southern Education Foundation. And he also wrote about how the policies like charter schools and vouchers are based in segregation. So there's just, in addition to the wonderful work you've been doing, there's a growing recognition among scholars that this is where school choice ideology is coming from. It's coming from a desire to restore segregated schools. And
Yep.
it has that effect. And these countries that have enacted a more or less privatized system would be Chile, where Milton Friedman had a huge influence in writing the Chilean constitution, and also Sweden, where a very conservative party took control of the country, I guess won the elections in 1992, and they introduced for-profit schooling and private schooling, which was subsidized by the government. It should be noted that both of those countries saw no academic progress, but saw soaring segregation, segregation along lines of ethnicity, race, socioeconomics, religion. I mean, you name it. People just wanted to go to school with people who looked exactly like themselves and were in the same social class.
And Diane, I can add to that in a way that speaks to a topic we'll get to later today, the passionate resistance, as you called it, to school privatization, that Democracy in Chains has a chapter on what happened in Chile. And one thing I think people would want to know is that in 2011, a huge student movement started against the privatization of education with extraordinary leadership, extraordinary support from the wider population. And in the past 2 years, some amazing things have come from that. One, and again, it started in the student movement. One is an effort to, and they want the creation of a referendum to change the Constitution and to throw out that Pinochet Constitution that James Buchanan had advised on. And also, they just had a presidential election in which they elected a former leader of that student movement, who is the youngest, I believe he's the youngest head of state in the world. So I think it's a story that might be inspiring to our students as well, to know that people come out of these student struggles, but can go on to the highest offices in a country.
Yeah, that is a wonderful story. Where we are today is that with the Republican ascendancy in so many states, I forget if they're in 26 states or what the exact number is, about almost every one of those states, I think it's 16, and lots of legislation introduced, and the others are moving towards vouchers. I just saw 2 articles today, one about Alabama, another about Oklahoma, that would basically eliminate public schools. They would take the money that they spend on public schools and send a check to parents and call it an education savings account. And then parents could do whatever they wanted to do. They could homeschool, they could use the money to buy supplies, they could use it for a charter school, religious schools. I don't know if they could use it for a public school, because under these 2 plans, it's hard to see how public schools could even exist, because there would just be a massive amount of money in parents' pockets to decide what they want to do. So we see right now the most extremist kind of legislation coming forward. And it's very scary, because public education is one of the essential democratic institutions of our society. And up until recently, about 85 to 90% of kids were in public schools. This has been the case for a long time. And when we think about the greatest generation, when we think about all the achievements of our society, these were the achievements by and large of people who went to public schools, as I did. And our public school system has been a great equalizer. It can't cure poverty, and there are a lot of things it can do, mainly educate people. And I think what's scary about this move towards disestablishing public education and letting parents decide whether they want their kids to go to school at all, heads us in a direction where we're gonna retard science, technology. Our whole educational aspirations will be repressed by eliminating a good public school system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important for folks to have the historical perspective on all of this that both of us bring as people who study the past of our country. And at the time when all of these efforts began, you know, the Southern segregationists resisting the Brown decision, the free market fundamentalists like Milton Friedman and James Buchanan and Charles Koch, at that time, there's a great transnational study by 2 Harvard economists whose title escapes me now, but they found that at that moment, the United States was leading the world in the quality of our public education. You know, we were the envy of the world for public education at all levels. And now we have sunk so radically, and we can see how this cause really has weaponized divisions among our population, you know, above all race. And we're seeing them do that now in 2022 as an election strategy with these terrible attacks on teaching honest American history that they're presenting as critical race theory, which isn't even taught in the schools, but using, as my husband says, he's a former organizer, all three words work for them: critical race and theory, right? Which is probably why they landed on that. But so we're facing teachers, and I'm sure many on this call are facing fights to be able just to teach the truth about history, to say that our Constitution was crafted by many people who owned other human beings as slaveholders. That could land a teacher with a $10,000 fine and a loss of license in some places in America now, with the kind of legislation that those radicalized Republican legislatures you talked about are putting through. So yes, absolutely. One of the things that we've seen that's so dramatic in the past few years is how those 30 state legislatures controlled by Republicans have taken advantage of the pandemic and of parents' fears and frustrations and struggles in this incredibly challenging context to try to turn that anxiety and fear and exhaustion against public education itself. And we certainly saw that in Virginia. I'm sure there's folks on this call, on this webinar, who witnessed what's been happening in the Virginia schools, but in many different places, we've seen these donor-funded organizations leading fights against school boards and teachers for preparing students for the world that they're going to live in. So we have a lot to do. One thing I would say that on that too, though, if there are people who on the call whose states are seeing these laws against, what do they call them, divisive concepts with penalties for teachers and attacks on the school boards, there's a wonderful new coalition that we want to alert you to that's called Learn from History. And it brings together parents, teachers, students, and also all the main historical organizations in the country. So I think our hosts are going to drop that in the chat, but they have great downloadable materials. They're doing trainings, etc. So very important group to know about.
I think that's great. And I'm going to check into that. Although I think that the Network for Public Education has already joined with the historical associations. I think that what we're seeing here is a coalition of groups that have not necessarily worked together. And the one group we have not mentioned is the religious right. Catherine Stewart wrote a book called The Power Worshippers, and she has a couple of chapters about how the religious right has been out to eliminate public education forever. And while many people think that abortion is their big issue, that's not really true. They got their biggest impetus to get involved in education because they wanted to maintain the tax-exempt status of segregated colleges and schools. And when they realized that there was not a huge national constituency for their tax-exempt status, they found abortion and made that their issue. But they're all along, you've had people like Pat Buchanan and the guys at the Liberty Institute and Jerry Falwell and so forth saying, we should get rid of public education. All schools should be run by churches and religious groups. So you have the combination of the libertarian right, the racist, and the religious right, and plus a lot of people in business who aren't necessarily racist, but who don't want to pay taxes. And then, when you go, all right, there's the coalition. And now it's almost like the perfect storm, because in addition to the pandemic, we have this crazy thing about critical race theory. And as Nancy mentioned, I don't know of a single school that teaches critical race theory, but what the advocates of this attack have done is to say that any teaching about racism at all is critical race theory. And so if you teach children that there were lynchings, if you teach about the Ku Klux Klan, if you teach about the horrors of slavery, you're engaging in critical race theory. And it leaves teachers in a position where they really don't know what they're allowed to teach. And the safest path to take is to just skip over any history that might get them in trouble. This notion of divisive concepts is really horrible, because anything that's interesting in history is a divisive concept. I mean, there's very little in history that where all historians agree. There's always a good debate about why and how and who and whether. And divisive concepts are interesting. If we look back to textbooks written 50 years ago, there are no divisive concepts in them. And Dana Milbank of the Washington Post had a column a day or two ago in which he quoted at length from a textbook used in Virginia schools from the 1950s to the 1970s, which said that, you know, the slaves are very happy. They really have it well off. The masters want their slaves to be happy because they have an investment in them as property. And the missus has an obligation to take care of the slaves when they're sick, just as she would care of her own children. So it goes on in this very kind of syrupy way about how happy the slaves are. And this is what American school children were learning in the 1950s. I had a textbook like that too. And I had to unlearn what I had been taught from these sanitized textbooks. And I think what the other thing you should know about the new governor of Virginia is that his own children attend elite private schools, which no voucher is big enough to give admission to others. And his own children attend schools where critical race theory is taught. I mean, it's not wishy-washy. He was a member of the board of, I think it was the National Cathedral School, St. Albans, and they specifically said, we want our students to engage in learning about critical race theory, about systemic racism. So far as I know, none of that has been rolled back, but he, being the total hypocrite, used that as a campaign issue to help him get elected and say that parents should control everything.
Yeah, and I think this point you raise, Diane, about the religious right is so important, and it is a absolutely critical part of this kind of billionaire-funded and backed effort to really transform our society and shackle democracy. And one of the things that I've learned more and more about from folks like Catherine Stewart and Ann Nelson and my friend Lisa Graves over at True North Research, who actually had a great report out on this kind of thing today, is that there's just no way that this project could go through without the votes supplied by millions of white evangelical conservatives who are put in a constant state of fear and alarm by Fox News and the rest of the right-wing media ecosystem. And the entrepreneurial leaders at the top of that movement, people like Ralph Reed and his longtime partner, Tim Phillips, who went on to head the Koch network's Americans for Prosperity group, they, I think, understood what a great thing they could deliver up to their funders, in that white evangelical Christians were for a long time people who had been trained to be hostile to science, you know, to believe that the Bible was infallible, therefore you shouldn't trust evolution, you shouldn't teach evolution. And if you have that level of distrust of science and of mainstream institutions, then you're a population that's ripe to be disinformed in other ways. So white evangelical Christians became the most loyal Trump supporters, the most loyal Republican voters. They have become the core of the MAGA faction of the Republican Party. And of course, their leaders are pushing for, as you say, you know, public funding for Christian schools where they would teach, and they have been shown to teach history of the kind that you were just quoting, where they would teach creationism, where they would, you know, do all these other things. Also pushing homeschooling, turning homeschooling into yet another lucrative industry to supply the materials that homeschoolers would use and such. So this is really such a big and complex operation that has, you know, squarely in its targets public education and democracy and a society in which we respect people of different faiths, backgrounds, etc., and everyone is an equal citizen. All of these things are at stake now. So I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation and looking forward to, I see there's lots of questions building up too. So.
Well, I can remember, because I'm older than you are, Nancy, the period after World War II. And I graduated high school in 1956. And aside from having biased, bigoted, and racist textbooks, which I did, there was also in the country a feeling of we're all in this together, because we had just been through a world war. And there was a sense of some things you do because it's right for society. Some things you do because it's good for all of us. And what we have become now is what's best for me.
Mhm.
And so we have allowed ourselves to be changed from a country with a strong sense of civic duty to a country of consumers.
Mhm.
And my choice, my child, my choice, my body, my choice. I always find it funny to see these anti-abortion demonstrations where they say, well, of course, people who want abortion are saying my body, my choice, but at the anti-vax demonstrations, they're saying my body, my choice. So obviously these people would not agree. But the only time I can compare to the present with so much extremism and so much very loud and I don't know, out of control behavior is the 1950s. This period reminds me right now of McCarthyism, where teachers were being watched, where they were being asked to take loyalty oaths, where people were afraid because they thought their neighbors might report on them. And so we have laws being passed now. And I know that Governor Youngkin in Virginia set up a tip line. It's actually an email address where people could report teachers who were teaching something that was divisive. And the only good thing about that, I learned from Twitter, is that people were bombarding his tip line with ridiculous tips. They were warning him about teachers in Harry Potter's school, you know, and things of this sort. And I think they probably made his tip line utterly useless, which is a good thing.
That's great. You know, I think it's so important that you raise that question of the whole vision of society that we're talking about, because that's really what's at stake now. Two utterly different visions of who we are as a people and what we should be as a society going forward. And to me, you know, one of the biggest cons that this radical right has pushed is to say that they are in the spirit of the founders, that their ridiculous ideas of liberty, like my right not to wear a mask, even if I endanger your life or those in your family, that has nothing to do with the tempered liberty that was part of the founding of this country. This is a crazy libertarian, deadly dogma, so at odds with the best of American traditions and of longtime practice. You know, you were mentioning the 1950s, and it made me think of a great shorthand the economist Dean Baker came up with for these two rival visions of America. And he said, one of them is wit. You can summarize it as wit, which is we're in this together. And the other one is yo-yo. You're on your own. And that is exactly what we're seeing, is that, of the defenders of public education and the supporters of teachers and children and of embattled communities and people trying to make sure that others are safe in this pandemic. That's that sense of we're in it together. We need one another. We're all connected, as Dr. King so often said. But on the other side, we have these people who want to privatize everything. You know, their ideal vision of government is armies, courts, and police, national defense, rule of law, and guarantee social order. No public education, no social security, no national parks, no post office. They are ideologically opposed to all of these things, and they know that's not popular, so they don't make it really public, but they work incrementally to achieve these things. And that's why I think, for people to understand all that's at stake is just absolutely crucial in this moment. And also for us to stand in solidarity with those who are under attack, especially teachers who are trying to do right by their students, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the content of the history they teach. And I don't think it's any coincidence at all that this attack on the teaching of race came after the murder of George Floyd, because seeing that footage, seeing that videotape led people across the country to say, oh my God, that was murder. I have a stepbrother he's a heavy equipment operator, construction worker, and he told me that was murder, and so many people saw that, and so many white people woke up and came out to those demonstrations, even in the pandemic. Books about race surged to the top of the bestsellers list. And that's what this radical right was afraid of, because if we talk about structural racism, we're going to be talking about the need for government action to offset the things that private corporations have done to communities, including things like environmental racism, which is so important, a target and so frightening to these fossil fuel executives like Charles Koch and many of the other kinds of donors he has, who really, not above all, because all these things are connected, but they really want to stop action on the coming climate catastrophe they're causing. And that's part of why they feel so urgent.
Well, one of the things that bothers me, I can't say the most because I could probably think of something else that was bothered me even more. But one of the things that really bothers me is the way that the school choice is being portrayed as a civil rights issue. And whether it was Betsy DeVos or Donald Trump, and even some Democrats who say school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. And, my response is civil rights is the civil rights issue of our time. Voting rights is the civil rights issue of our time, but not school choice. And what this reflects to me is the conscious cultivation in the Black community of people who will come forward and say, Black kids are so badly educated in public schools, they must be in voucher schools. They will do much better in religious schools. They will do much better in charter schools. And there is actually evidence on these issues, which is that charter schools do not perform better than public schools. In many instances, therefore, worse. The greatest number of failing schools in the state of Ohio are charter schools. They call them community schools, but they're privately run charter schools, and they are failing. There have been incredible scandals, like the state auditor in Oklahoma just the other day said that the Epic charter schools had embezzled so much that it was the worst abuse of public taxpayer funding in the history of the state of Oklahoma. There was a similar incident in California where some online charter operators embezzled $250 million. This is not the kind of thing that happens in public schools where there's oversight, transparency, and accountability. But this is not the civil rights issue of our time. This is the for-profit making issue of our time that's intended to destroy a basic civic institution whose purpose is to bring us together, not to divide us.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to go to the question Q&A, but I'll do that after you speak.
Okay, I was just going to say that is such an example of jujitsu by the right, where you take your opponent's strength and turn it against them. And that is what they did. These are the people who, the people behind the vouchers, and Milton Friedman and Charles Koch, all of them oppose every single element of civil rights legislation at every single step. The Civil Rights Act, the vote, all these things that you could point to, they opposed through the years, reforms that would actually strengthen opportunity for African Americans, that would level the playing field, that would, create a better society for all of us. They opposed those, but they latched onto this framing of vouchers for a particular reason. And here again, I think, having a historical perspective is really illuminating, because as they were pushing for privatizing education after 1955 and riding on the wave of Southern segregationism, they hit a wall. They hit a wall when they tried to get into the white suburbs, where, thanks to the litigation that people like them waged, desegregation hadn't reached. Metropolitan desegregation remedies were undermined with the Milliken versus Bradley decision of, I believe it was 1971. And all these white parents who voted Republican were like, oh, why would we want to get rid of our public schools? That's why we moved to these fancy suburbs. And so they couldn't get ahead with voters with their, as they called it, their traditional constituency. There was actually a key white paper by a man named Horowitz in the 80s about this. And he argued for non-traditional alliances, meaning with particularly Black, but also Latino parents. And so that's when they started pushing for urban vouchers in particular, because they found a group of parents who were understandably dissatisfied with the quality of the education their kids were getting, but not because it was public, but because of what had been done to it, by these other court challenges and the defunding of cities and so forth. But they have really, really ridden that hard. But I think that's really, I don't know, I've seen a lot of signs that the momentum has kind of stalled with that, because more and more Black parents and community activists are realizing, as you said, these schools, the vouchers and the charter schools are terrible, and they're not doing what they were promised they would do. And in many cases, a dear friend of mine from Chicago was active with the American Federation of Teachers in unionizing charter schools because the teachers were so frustrated with the conditions and with their inability to support their students in these private schools. So maybe that takes us actually, Diane, to a point where I wanted to ask you a question,
Sure.
if I may, before we go to the chat and all the questions, but it kind of speaks to some of the questions that I've peeked at as we were speaking. And that is, you wrote this wonderful 2020 book called Slaying Goliath, that focused on what you call the passionate resistance to privatization and in support of public education. And I've met some of the people engaged in that, who I saw had registered for this Zoom. But I wonder what you would say, what's happened since then? Where else are you seeing the passionate resistance that you charted in that book? Where are we seeing it now, and how might looking to those examples be helpful for the people who are with us today?
Well, of course, the book was written before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it came out in January of 2020, and I was traveling in the country promoting the book, and suddenly everything closed down. And no one wanted to know about privatization or the future of public education. All they wanted to know about was, should schools be open or closed? And how do I keep my child safe? Do I keep them home? And how horrible is remote learning? And at the time, I would say there was enormous appreciation for teachers and recognizing that they do heroic work. I remember a tweet where someone said, "I don't know how teachers do it. I can't even educate the 2 that are in my home, let alone 30. But the resistance is there. The resistance has to organize. It doesn't come up spontaneously. There's always someone in every state and community who's willing to take the lead. And I think it's very important to be part of a group, because once in a while, one person can make a difference. And I tried to identify people who had made a difference, like in Nashville, Tennessee, where a woman ran for school board and really changed the whole trajectory of the charter movement there, because she was aware of what was going on and made the school board aware. But this ties into some of the questions that have come up about what do we do. So one of them is this. In Arizona, the legislature has just introduced another gigantic voucher expansion. Last year, the bill was dropped with a stunning video featuring Dr. Martin Luther King and calling school choice the civil rights issue of our time. Betsy DeVos's American Federation for Children has recruited dozens of Black pastors to shamelessly parade out speaking for vouchers to escape so-called failing schools. We're rallying again for the 5th year in a row, but it's sad to see vouchers gaining ground in states like New Hampshire and Georgia, even with some Democratic support. Can you share some hope? Well, I think that Arizona is just a great example of hope, because when the voucher issue came up for a referendum in I think it was 2018, parents, teachers organized, and they were up against the Koch brothers. I mean, at that time there were brothers. There's only one left now, but the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos poured millions of dollars into Arizona to put across the referendum. First of all, they didn't want a referendum, so the Koch brothers took the parents' groups, SOS Arizona. They took them to court to try to stop the referendum because they were not sanguine about passing it. And so they got their lawyers out there and said that the signatures were invalid. They came up with a million different legal reasons, but the court said the referendum should proceed. And the parents organized, teachers organized, they worked closely together as SOS Arizona, and they won. The parents and teachers won. They won 2/3 of the vote. I mean, the vouchers were blocked 65-35. So the hope is get a referendum wherever you can, because there have been something like 20, 21, 22 state referenda over the years. Not one of them has ever passed. But there's the example of Florida, where in 2012, there was a referendum on vouchers, and they called it, they didn't say vouchers, they used the term the Religious Liberty Act. So if you're in favor of religious liberty, you vote for vouchers. because the Florida state constitution does not permit any money to go to religious schools. And so Jeb Bush wanted to change the state constitution to allow vouchers. And so to fight vouchers, you had to persuade people to vote against religious liberty. And that one went down 55-45. Had it been put on the ballot as, do you want to allow vouchers for religious schools, I'm convinced it would have gone down at least 65-35. So the public does not support vouchers. The poll after poll shows this, referendums show it. And I think the great hope is to give power to the public to express their view. But you're right about the New Hampshire and Georgia and Ohio. There's a lawsuit by 100 school districts in Ohio against the state vouchers. Oklahoma is going the backpack full of cash route. I mean, the whole voucher movement is exploding. And the way to stop it is through massive public demonstrations. And hopefully, if your state permits it, a referendum, because they cannot win a referendum.
I think that's really important. And also another thing I might add is, and you kind of gestured to this, but running for school boards, right? Running for the state legislature. I know in Arizona, along with the amazing Save Our Schools movement, there were also teachers who ran for the state legislature, some of whom are now in the state legislature. And I think that that's something that we have to realize, that no one is coming to save us, right? This is on us, on all of us. And if we value our public schools, if we value our democracy, then we need to join with the tens of thousands, maybe more, of others who are doing this work now. And we need to do things like, don't just give to your school. I saw a great tweet about this, copies of Mouse and other books that have been, taken out of the libraries by these people. Run for the school board, be part of the decision making, stop these things in their tracks. And I think, this is one of the things I think about a lot with this moment that we're in, that we're really on the precipice of a very frightening place, right? And we know that with the shackling of democracy, the January 6th insurrection, attempted coup, all of these different things. But the reason that we're there is because there was so much power and so much change from the progressive side and with the majority support, that the radical right knew they could never win unless they really went hard on all these different fronts. And so I think what that tells us is that we have the majority on issue after issue. As you just said, Diane, they never win a referendum on these issues or things that are out in the light and transparency. What we need to do, though, is make that an active majority and make sure people are doing things like running for the school boards, writing letters to the editors, calling your radio station, getting voters registered, and making sure that people vote the whole ballot when they go to vote for presidents and senators. I mean, we found in North Carolina, the number of ballots, the number of races, down ballot races that were left unmarked could have changed our General Assembly. So I think we have a massive job, but an exciting job ahead of us as citizens to begin mobilizing for change, really from the bottom up, like our great friends. And I think we both know the good folks of Save Our State in Arizona. I got to spend some time with them and hear about the work they were doing back in the before times, before COVID, and even just before that election in 2018. So there's really a lot that can be done.
Well, I think that it's important to realize that we are the power and we have to organize. And I think, on the other hand, the anti-vaxxers are making it very dangerous to be a school board member. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a conscious policy to discourage people from wanting to be on school boards. And they have, I've seen Proud Boys showing up at school board meetings. This is very intimidating when you have thugs and you don't know if they're armed or not armed. I don't know if they have a metal detector at school board meetings, but it makes it very frightening. And again, it's a fascist threat to our democracy. And our democracy begins with school boards. Sometimes they do a great job. Sometimes, as in the county in Tennessee where they banned Mouse, they do a horrible job. But I think the backlash to them has been overwhelming. And it's probably made Mouse the #1 best-selling book on Amazon right now. So I think that there's a price to be paid for book banning. And probably is someone said to me, the best way to encourage kids to read a book is to ban it.
Yes.
They just have to have access to it. When they take it out of the school library and then take it out of the public library, it's pretty tough. Although one of my friends, Mercedes Schneider, who's a blogger, pointed out that a lot of books that are copyrighted books can be found on the internet for free. And Mouse is on the internet, and she posted the links where you can see Mouse for free. It's all gotten, as I say, to the point of ridiculousness, except that I've realized that over the years, Republicans whose main issue is to protect the money of billionaires and multimillionaires, that they have nothing to offer to working class and poor people and even to middle class people. So what they rely on time after time is a culture war issue. And so whether it's abortion or guns or gays, I remember that was the issue in the McGovern election: abortion, guns, and gays. And this time it'll be critical race theory and masking. Although, you know, most people in this country wear masks and most people have been vaccinated. So I'm not sure that's going to be a winning issue. But again, they're deflecting attention from the fact that they have no program. They didn't even have Republicans didn't even have a platform at their last convention. They just said whatever Trump wants. And so I think that somehow we have to get across to people, it's to your benefit to be informed. It's to your benefit to have your children well educated. They will not be, if you're worried about your children being indoctrinated, don't send them to a religious school. And on the subject of religious schools, I should mention that in addition to charters being no better than public schools and usually much worse, the voucher schools get horrible ratings when they've been studied, even in studies that have been funded by conservative groups. They show that kids who go to voucher schools do worse than the peers they left behind in public school. The voucher schools also have a very high attrition rate because after a year or two, as kids see they're falling behind and as their parents see they're falling behind, they pull them out. So what the religious right and the racist are advocating is worse education for American kids. And it's hard to get that across when there are so many people who are ideologically tied to very bad ideas, and they just keep pouring more and more money into ideas that have already failed. There's a question here that I'd like to take up. Someone says, do you agree that the assault on public education was largely made possible by the neoliberal standards and accountability movement promulgated by No Child Left Behind and raised to the top? It seems those reforms hollowed out public education and deprofessionalized teachers. Yes, the short answer is yes. I think that the placing so much emphasis on data was to the benefit of well-resourced schools and made it look as though schools where there were poor kids were bad schools simply because the kids are with test scores. Well-to-do kids get high scores. Poor kids get low scores. Every standardized test in the world reflects family income. So if you're going to say that we'll close your school or your school's a failing school because the scores are low, that's a heavy hammer that's wielded in poor communities. And yes, I do think that the standards and accountability movement have moved us in the wrong direction. And we should be hopefully one day moving towards a more child-centered holistic education where what we care about most is, first of all, the well-being of the child, the well-being of the family, and something called real education, where children learn from a sense of interest, from joy, from a desire to learn, and not just of a fear of being punished because their test scores are not high enough.
So beautifully said. And Diane, if I may say, whoever asked that really needs to read your corpus of work through the years, because I've often pointed to you as you know, a hero in many ways, but on this particular point too, as someone who really cared about an issue and looked at the empirical evidence of what was happening and said, no, wait a minute, and changed your views, and then became, you know, a passionate advocate, you know, against that agenda of testing and accountability and punishing schools rather than doing the kind of whole child educating and exciting that you were just talking about. But really, I mean, to just go to your bookshelf is to see that issue play out over the years, and the learning that's been done by people who really believe in children and in education is kind of condensed there. I think that vast pool of wisdom. So so just wanted to say that.
Oh, well, thank you, Anne. There is a question here. We here in Indiana are battling the legislation to eliminate divisive concepts, parent involvement with curriculum, to opt out of certain teachings, etc. Do you have talking points for our emails and testimony to legislators to fight these bills? The question comes from Ann Duff in Indiana, and I mention this only because she's the person who beats me at Words with Friends regularly, and has an amazing vocabulary. But Ann, I will make sure that the Network for Public Education pulls together talking points that you can use. I think the most important talking point is teach truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will just add to that, Diane, and I hope our hosts will drop the link in the chat, that there is this new coalition. It started, I think, just this past year. I've been on a couple of their webinar Zoom calls, but they have downloadable talking points for different constituencies, for school boards, for teachers, for parents, for kids, and they're also bringing on student organizers, because students are the best witnesses for this, right, and the best messengers for saying we need to understand the truth of our world in order to be able to act effectively in it. And they have done a lot of polling as well that shows, you know, just what Diane is saying about, you know, teaching truth, and that the vast majority of parents want their children to know the full, accurate story, not a kind of candy-coated version of that. And one more thing too, because you raised the question or the phrase religious liberty. This is another one of these jujitsu things on the right, where there can be very sophisticated about message packaging. And as you say, you know, instead of saying they just want things to go to religious schools, right, or for people to kowtow to religious bigotry, they have learned that what will work, including with the Supreme Court, is this religious liberty framing. So that was the whole Hobby Lobby effort. But basically what they mean by religious liberty, and the organizations they fund do this exactly, it's the religious liberty to discriminate, the religious liberty to exclude, the religious liberty to teach nonsense. And so I think digging into that packing and, you know, that packaging and taking it apart and helping people really see what it means is an important part of our work going forward.
Yeah, I recall that a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the Orlando Sentinel did a series of articles about the voucher schools, and they visited many voucher schools, described how ill prepared their teachers were, how they had principals and superintendents who didn't have a college degree. It was really very alarming, but they also said that they were teaching racism and they were teaching stuff, you know, about science that was simply untrue. So I guess that's why I worry about where's our country going if we're going to continue to have more and more children sent to schools that teach, as you put it, nonsense, and teach racism, teach bigotry, and schools that are allowed to exclude kids because they're gay, to fire staff members because they're gay, or to say a girl can't come to school unless she's wearing a skirt. I mean, this is not what we think of with public education. Public education is inclusive. It introduces children to the diversity of our nation, which reminds me of another point I want to make before we run out of time. There are a lot of parents in this country who are Black parents. They too want to hear honest history. They don't want to hear the whitewash 1950s version of happy slaves. And so we're forgetting that the population is changing. And I think that so much of what we're seeing in terms of this kind of attack on public school is an effort to turn back the tide, to pretend that we're back in 1955 again, and we're not. We really have to educate our children to live in the 21st century. And what is happening with voucher schools and charter schools and religious schools is not taking us there.
Not. Yeah, Wow. May I just say to the host too, I hope that you will make available the chat to participants too, because there have been so many, and the questions too, for all of us going forward, because there have been so many rich comments and questions in the chat and the Q&A. It would be lovely for people to be able to almost use that to set an agenda possibly for future such conversations. And I know you have many other wonderful webinars planned, and there's a lot to talk as we try to right the ship of our country and our world.
Yes,
So-
it's a very rich discussion in the chat, and we will definitely save these. I think we may have time for one more question if you both want to respond to one more.
I want to respond to one, and then Nancy can pick whichever one she wants. What are 3 things citizens can do to flip this privatization voucher effort in our states? Number 1 is organize people to elect different legislators. That is crucial. You cannot have these crazy right-wingers running your state and expect to get better results. The other thing is join the Network for Public Education. We have a very active organization that sends out alerts to people in states when there is critical legislation coming up. We try to help people organize within their own state and connect to others who are like-minded with them. And the third is just organize, organize, organize. And if you organize, you can flip this by getting people to vote for better candidates and encourage people to run for school board or run for school board yourself or run for the legislature yourself. There are so many things we can do, but the most important thing we have to do is to let these narrow-minded legislators know that they're not going to be reelected if they continue attacking our basic institutions.
That's great. I totally agree. And I would add maybe one more thing and yet another resource, but to give a shout out to my good friend, Donald Cohen, and the organization In the Public Interest, which has a fabulous website chock full of resources. So if you're facing a privatization effort of anything in your community, whether it's schools or water or roads or all the other things that these forces try to come after, go to the website of In the Public Interest. And Donald and a co-author also have a new book out called The Privatization of Everything, which brings together all this knowledge and information. So that's another resource as far as, you know, shedding light on what we're facing and we're up against. And I would only add to Diane's terrific list of things you can do. Think about really getting involved in the democratic process too. I think all of us can look to Georgia and what they were able to achieve with deep canvassing that was going neighbor to neighbor, you know, person to person, and really listening, finding out what people's concerns are, finding out what their needs are. And they are in the eye of the storm of the, you know, forces for and against democracy now, as in the civil rights era. And I think that model, which is out there in webinars and other things that you could probably just download from YouTube, but that is the kind of thing that we need, you know, from the grassroots up, whether it's folks with your local school and organizing there, or whether it's with these coming midterms in 2022 that will be all important for stopping what we've been talking about and creating space for better things to happen. That kind of, you know, deep person-to-person organizing is going to be crucial.
Thank you both so much. I am so loath to say that we are out of time in our hour, but our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Diane Ravitch and Dr. Nancy MacLean for being here with us today and teaching us and inspiring us in a moment when we need all the knowledge and inspiration that we can get. So thank you. And thank you to the Network for Public Education for co-sponsoring and promoting this event. And thank you to our audience working so hard across the country on behalf of public schools and students. Please sign up and follow the Network for Public Education, the other amazing resources that have been mentioned today, which we will have also put in the chat, and we will also make sure you all get, and sign up to follow Public Funds Public Schools on our website and social media. We can't wait to see you next time. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Nancy.
Oh, so good to be with you, Diane. It's such an honor.